It's lovely to be with you, the friends of Kenwood. Thank you for being on your Zoom today. It's a beautiful blue sky outside here. I'm actually at Somerset House, and of course the place is looking glorious. I'm going to start with a little bit of Courtauld history because I think it's relevant about sort of how we came to be here and then what has happened since. So we take our history back to three wonderful founders. And indeed, I often add their wives into the picture because the women at the side of these men were as nearly as influential and sometimes as influential as they were. But Samuel Courtauld, Sir Robert Witt, and Arthur Lord Lea Ferrum were part of a very small group, the leaders of a very small group that put together the concept in the 1920s of creating an institute for the study of art history. And as part of the thinking about that this institute would also have a great collection. And they indeed were the first donors for that collection. Samuel Courtauld himself, who gave his house, he's seen here on the left, his house at Portman Square, to become the fledgling Courtauld. When his wife died, he decided to hand this great Adam house over to the new institute, just as well as I think the university would probably have dragged its feet. This was to be an institute at the heart of the University of London. And we indeed are still part of that university, though we've changed status within it. So the early Courtauld was in this building in the center of the picture. And there were indeed some of the great impressionists from Samuel Courtauld's collections on the walls of the teaching spaces. A very strange phenomenon, but of course those who studied in that era, and many are with us, remember it all very fondly. But the Courtauld continued to expand, but furthermore, it expanded into an adjacent house, into the mews behind it, and indeed created a gallery in Woburn Square. But on top of the new building created for the Warburg Institution, which Courtauld and his friends had also helped bring to London in 1933. But there's a problem. The house in Portman Square, the lease fell in, and a new site was found. Expanding the Warburg proved impossible because what became historic England subsequently would not give permission to knock down the rest of the late Georgian, early Victorian square. And by great sort of both serendipity and brilliant thinking on the part of a number of key people within and without government, we moved to the north block of Somerset House. Now, again, Richard alluded to the past history of Somerset House, but the history goes back a long way. It was one of Somerset, the name Somerset comes from the Duke of Somerset. It was a Tudor palace. And of course, famously, its gardens, or the view from its gardens, were depicted by Canaletto in the mid-18th century. But by that time, the buildings were already beginning to get a little bit in disrepair. And by the 1770s, George III decided to transform them into really, I could only call a vehicle of sort of colonial development. The great site on the banks of the river, in which the front building would be dedicated to the Navy, Britain's great, of course, original force, and you see it on the top right-hand side, and with access directly from the river. Certainly at high tide, I assume not at low tide. But that involved demolishing the remaining buildings and rebuilding this rather large complex, which was built in several phases. But if it's looked at in its totality, it now has, as an additional element, the King's building here and what we call the new building on this side by Pennethorne. But the core of Somerset House originally was this space in the center, and the Courtauld moved in the late 1980s to 1990 to inhabit this north block. Now, the north block was particularly interesting. It's perhaps the grandest of the blocks because it was designed to house the institutions of the Enlightenment, the Royal Academy of Arts, the Royal Society, and the Antiquaries. And you see here both the entrance from the Strand and also the great room of the Royal Academy at a summer exhibition very early in its history in 1787. and with that absolutely traditional late 18th, early 19th century hang. Subsequently, though, of course, the Academy and then the Royal Society moved out, and the buildings of several of the buildings of the Somerset House, which were already dealing with revenue, also were allocated to the new register of births, marriages, and deaths of Britain. And this depicts that period in its history. And of course, when the Courtauld moved in the late 1980s, the courtyard was not as it looks now. That was a feature of philanthropy, the Heritage Lottery Funds investment. But at this stage, it was the car park for all the revenue officers, which had steadily taken over the whole of the complex, and a deeply gloomy place in many ways. But the Courtauld nonetheless moved in and started the transformation of the building in the North Block. Now, what was interesting to me coming into the Courtauld in 2004 was that the transformation, the physical transformation that had taken place when the Courtauld moved into Somerset House was curiously worked by two separate architects. So the gallery spaces were worked by one architect, and the other spaces to the right and the left, and the basements, which of course are very important, and the location of our libraries, were worked by a second architect. And some of the ways in which we started to use the space replicated the physical structure of Chambers' original building, which was really built as a series of vertical houses, not as a set of lateral spaces across which you could move. And even within the central block where the societies were, and I'm sorry I haven't got a slide of this, but the system was very demarcated and very illogical to the eye when you look at it on plan, in that most of the areas, not even all the areas that you see now depicted as sort of coloured up, were managed by the Royal Academy, but some were. But there were divisions and blocked doors. The Royal Academy owned the left-hand staircase. The right-hand staircase was shared by the antiquaries in the Royal Society, who apparently were discomforted by that even from the very beginning of their occupation, and squabbled over the staircase. They shared an antechamber, but then within the piano nobile, they sort of had different rooms and different meeting rooms and so on. And the great room at the top was of course the Royal Academy. But what I'm showing in this slide is actually the space that was used by the gallery. And then the other spaces, which before we did this refurbishment, which were made accessible to the public. Our lecture theatre, which sits at the top of the stairs up on the right-hand side, and then stuck in the middle and accessed with great difficulty by a series of different corridors and stairs, our research forum, and then our public programs were on the ground floor. But our public spaces were, as you can see, scattered through the building. It was an impossible building to explain to anybody in terms of its physical logic, very difficult to give people directions, and people always found themselves disoriented in it. But besides that, there were endless changes of level. I think we counted there were 44 changes of level. So in terms of accessibility, it was pretty horrendous. These are the only spaces which are accessible with, by anybody with physical disability without moving up or down steps. And as you will realize shortly, that means even the vestibule, which is the central space, what we call the center of the donut, only the central carriageway was accessible. To get to our lift, you had to go up at least 14 steps. But as you can see, there are accessibility problems there. This is the entrance. Another challenge that was very evident was that anybody approaching the Courtauld from the Strand to look for our entrance, which is there on the upper image, which is to the right-hand side under the archway, would simply miss it. They walk straight through the vestibule and into the bright light of Somerset House. Our stairs, our beautiful chamber stairs, were absolutely wonderful and are absolutely wonderful, but perhaps not so wonderful when you're carrying large artworks up them. We had one small lift which had to share the job of moving people and objects up the stairs, but its capacity was very limited, and we were only able to get works up to a certain scale. Sometimes they had to be taken out of their crates when we were doing exhibitions before they got into the lift and so on. Not the way a modern or professional museum or gallery should work. And I have to admit, these two images here are perhaps deliberately gloomy, but nonetheless, they make a point I want to make, which is that we all loved the old Courtauld. It was always a thrill to come in and see the works of art on the walls because of their sheer quality. But as a museum or gallery professional, there were many deficiencies. The lighting was very poor. The system of hanging was archaic. It was rather like a domestic hanging of the 1930s. It did in fact replicate how Samuel Courtauld had hung works in the 1920s when he collected them. We had chandeliers adding to the lighting scheme, but actually of inappropriate period and design and modern versions. And the flooring of pine, which had been a cheap solution in the 1980s when we moved in, was buffed, scruffed, and deeply unpleasant. Now, I hope that many visitors didn't actually really focus on that when they came in, but some did. Furthermore, there's an interesting configuration of the doors, which I think you can see in one of these slides, which is that each doorway had 4 doors, each of which projected either into the room or out into the adjacent room or into the corridor. These 2 blocked light, they took space, they somehow interfered, people knocked them into them, and they reduced the usable space in the gallery. This shows the north and the south larger rooms in the first floor, the piano nobile of the gallery. So the lighting isn't quite as bad as I'd indicated in the previous ones, but it gives you some idea of the chain hang, the floors, and the chandeliers and the doors. And of course, as Richard mentioned, the great room of the Royal Academy, wonderful, wonderful space, was invisible to the eye. If you knew, it had been divided up around the millennium, and if you knew to look up, you would look up and see dimly above your head the windows of the central sort of cupola of the space. But mostly, of course, your eye was brought down below the false roof that had been built in to see the works, which admittedly were wonderful, but it was a carving up of about 5 or 6 different spaces in that. Our storage was inadequate, to say the least, and tucked into back rooms adjacent to the security room and to the security staff's toilets. Again, not a massively lovely situation. I can show you this now because, of course, it no longer exists. Now, our aim, therefore, was to do something much more dramatic, and to do something which would really serve the collection and serve the public fully. And having realized that this was a sort of challenge that needed to be addressed, really going back, to about 10 years ago, we started working initially on a master plan for the whole building using John McCaslin as architects, and then having gained a view of the general picture of what we were trying to do for the whole building, we then had a further competition, which was won by a wonderful group of young architects, or of course 10 years younger than they are now, called Witherford Watson Mann, who had just in 2013 won the Sterling Prize for their wonderful transformation of a landmark property called Astley, landmark trust property called Astley Castle. They sort of recognize, they had, in a say, fully internalized the problems of the building, deeply historically interested. One of their great specialities is the transformation of historic buildings. And what they proposed for us was something which is no less than a sort of full transformation of the building, while retaining the very best of its historic qualities, seeking to intervene where necessary, but only where necessary, and to restore or conserve the original building where possible. But this is the scheme that they have devised, gives us over 91% accessibility, and the 9% that it will remain sort of not fully accessible when we have completed the full project will be some areas in the library which students will not be able to access, but there will be other places where they can sit and so on. So these are matters of choice rather than of necessity. So the aim over the whole project, of which the gallery project is part, is to make a fully accessible building in this way. In order to do this, it will involve in the next phase, and I'll come back to that, in introducing, or rather not introducing, moving a stairwell, which is currently sitting at the far east end of the building, into a more central position in the east wing. But it's also involved leveling floors, particularly across the lower ground floor, in order for there to be smooth access between the two buildings and for visitors, and a number of other very delicate interventions, but also opening up the area, which is now our temporary exhibition space, and taking out a mezzanine, which Historic England have allowed us to do. This is perhaps a better depiction of the cross-section of the building. But I should emphasize here that the building, of course, is, if not as big, but nearly as big in the lower ground floor and the basements as in the stories above ground. So it is significantly built larger than appears at the moment. And the other thing that we have done is introduce a lift into this part of the building, which is our conservation department. Now, one of the main challenges was to get full accessibility into our front door, which is seen here now with the new paving all in place, and it involves some very gentle ramping up from the street under the two sets of arches, which you can see here in the drawing that was originally produced and in the actuality. So in the actuality, the ramping is very delicate and doesn't interfere visibly with the architecture, so that is respected. These have been very sort of complicated, subtle arrangements. And the aim, as this other drawing by Witherford Watson Mann shows, is to expand the generosity of the Courtauld, to make the Courtauld both as a gallery, as a collection, and as an academic institution, open and welcome to a much wider community of people. And so ultimately, the public dimensions of all that the Courtauld Institute, the academic institute, does are linking up with all that is done through our general public programs department and the gallery program of exhibitions and loans and so on itself. So this is as a representation of that. But one element we have already put in, which is our learning center, which is on the ground floor, as we're in the east wing of the building, and that's already in place and operating, and comes right off the courtyard. But the shop, as a shop and cafe combined, running through the lower ground floor, will also link in due course with areas where our students can have their social spaces and then can go from there into our library. But conceptually, as you can see, is that the Courtauld wants to see itself very much as a hub for teaching, research, curating, displaying and caring for collections, but speaking to, engaging with communities and organizations and individuals, both locally, nationally and internationally. This too shows the same drawing pretty much schematically, so I will move on to the plans. Now, one of the curiosities of the Courtauld as we had it was that the entrance was here on the ground floor, quite cramped. If we had an exhibition which drew a lot of visitors, it was very congested. And behind it was our first gallery. The space now, the ticket hall, or it was a gallery for our medieval and early Renaissance collections. But the typical visitor went straight on up the stairs and completely missed it. It was completely apart from the circuitry of the whole gallery. And we realized that also with our aspiration to increase visitor numbers, we would need a more generous way of welcoming visitors. We also realized we would need, despite our existing 14, I think, is it, or 16 stairs, that ironically, we needed a better stairway from the ground floor to the lower ground floor. So we need to build that staircase, another cantilevered staircase, and that required space. So the gallery was moved out of that, and I'll show you how we resolved it shortly, and we created a generous welcoming space, with all of which have provide level access to those with physical needs and disabilities. We then did something which had started a little earlier. We had got to know Witherford, Watson Mann as architects when they did the work on our drawings gallery some years earlier. This was completed, I think, in 2016. And in working them, we realized that we could carve out another space on that same mezzanine floor, which we now call level 1 or first floor, for our medieval and early Renaissance works, which you see examples of illustrated here, which are a phenomenal collection, which has perhaps never had as much presence, as much recognition as we always wanted it to. So this is both of these spaces are very complex in terms of the physical building. It meant dropping floors, raising ceilings, working within existing structures which had been put in possibly in the 1950s, where in the medieval and early Renaissance gallery, as is now, there are heavy concrete beams, as there were right through that block of the building. And but nonetheless, we needed very carefully graded floor levels to allow a person in a wheelchair to move between the spaces. But we, I think, have achieved that. This was the drawings gallery, originally done by William Witherford Watson Mann. And you see here the door leading gently into the medieval and Renaissance gallery as it's now reconverted, which is now a lovely sort of cool gallery, but where these wonderful gold ground works of the 14th, 15th centuries can show to great effect. But this slide actually does show you the physical constraints with which we were working, these very heavy duty concrete beams. And so we tried to work with them as well as we could, constructing the cases, as it were, to line up with and therefore take the eye away from the physical challenges that we had to face, and dropping lighting above that. At first sight, it seemed that there was less to be done in the great second floor fine rooms, but what we had decided to do with the hang was to take a chronological sequence. Now, most of the great impressionists had been thrust into the three spaces which are now labeled Renaissance and which are our great Renaissance collections. But we now have a sort of coherent chronological sequence running through the great Italian Renaissance, in the first two galleries, and then the Northern Renaissance in the third, moving on into the 17th century with early Rubens, with Rubens' sketches and Modella, and then some of the great, as well, finished Rubens that we have in our collection, like the family of Jan Bruegel the Elder, and other artists of the same era, and many with connections with Bruegel, Bruegel's connections with Rubens. So there's a cross link between all these artists, and that story is told in that gallery. And then on into the 18th century, which is primarily our British collection, but not only that, it also has our Goya and our Major Goya and some of the works by Tiepolo in the collection. But it also shows the silver work that was created by the Courtauld family, who, when they first arrived in England as Huguenot refugees, were goldsmiths and silversmiths. So that's a nice story, including the story of Louisa Courtauld, who was a silversmith herself. So it's a rather nice story to be told there of an early woman artist. And these galleries have, the ways in which we have transformed them is by really taking out all the clutter, creating a very delicate and much considered color scheme, redoing all the lighting with modern track lighting, but which I hope you can hardly see in this image, but which works in two ways. One, it casts some light on the ceilings, which had really not been looked at for a long time, but many of them are original decorated ceilings. Some of them, they have replicas because the Royal Academy took the originals with them when they went, but showing the general decoration of the ceilings, and still allowing space to give the works a good, as well as appropriate space, appropriate lighting, and a sense of their presence. I've just dropped in a slide here to make reference to the fact that, of course, one of the big tasks throughout the project, but which obviously came to a culmination towards the end, was rethinking the interpretation of the collection, rethinking the labeling, rethinking text panels, trying to manage the balance between academic rigor and clarity of explanation and understanding. And our big wall panels now both explain the content of the room, individual labels, obviously the works, but they also explain the history of the rooms that people are in. So you'll understand the history of the building at the same time as the history of the work of art and how it relates to the collection. And you'll see a little element here, which I'll just point out, is the old strip pine floors have gone, and instead we have beautiful English oak. All of it laid in a traditional 18th century manner with wider planks in the center of the room, shading to narrower from the side, which gives a slight, it makes rooms feel more spacious. Here is it's a slightly foreshortened photograph, and I do apologize. I tried playing with it, but it actually makes it worse rather than better. But it shows one of the major rooms, or perhaps the other major room on this floor. And I'd just like to focus on the Botticelli Altarpiece, which is one of the largest, I think, two largest works by Botticelli in this country, which was hanging and rarely caught attention in the old hang. This has been fully conserved, including re-managing the panels of the painting and also the surface. It's been, the old grime has been taken away and recreated and reinstalled with a new frame based on sketches that we found on the back of the panels. So this is sort of original research and research on equivalent Florentine altar frames of the period. And it looks so much more magnificent now in this central position, along with other works of the period. But then, of course, the culmination, of course, is the top floor, where we wanted to show the great Impressionist and post-Impressionist collection. And normally you come up to the top of the stair on the left through the original Royal Academy great antechamber into the great room. So seeing works as you go, of course, with the great Renoir La Loge on your left-hand side in the antechamber, and moving on to the great room where you have a wall of Cézanne's, the Bar de Folie Bergère sitting at the top of at the north center of the north wall, and others arrayed around it. And then our new temporary exhibition spaces, which involved a huge amount of structural work to take away a sort of a middle floor, which we were allowed to do. Perhaps one of the several very complex technical dimensions of the project, but have created two as well flowing spaces, which I hope some of you will have seen visiting the Van Gogh exhibition self-portraits that we have on at the moment. And then in our 20th century gallery, which will rotate quite a lot, we decided to show initially the great Myth of Prometheus triptych by Oskar Kokoschka, which is so large that it can only rarely be shown, but to make a dramatic statement as we reopened. This was a gift, or came through the acceptance and use scheme as following the death of Count Antoine Zeilen, one of our other great donors, from whom we acquired also all the great Rubens collection that we so celebrate in many of our drawings. But I just want to say something about the challenge of the great room. This was one of our early drawings of what we were going to do in the great room. And it was just using the room as a large space and hanging. And I'm sure it would have been lovely in its own way, but we felt that it could somehow diminish the works by showing them in this way. So we went into a great deal of research and considered all sorts of interventions in the space, and this shows you some of the workings, with some intervening panels. The image on the left shows us playing with different scales of panels. I think these are larger than the ones in the end we've ended up with, which are on the right. But in order to give the room a sense of there's discovery, so you don't see everything when you come into it first time around. Now, these panels that we have put in are substantial. They needed to be substantial in order to carry the paintings they are carrying, but they are also removable. So we can open up the space. So they are technically sort of temporary structures. I just should also explain to you that the pictures on the walls in this workshop that we were doing are copies. They are not the real thing. The real things were actually probably on tour either to the Fondation Louis Vuitton or in Japan at the time. But this is how, in the end, we have created the gallery. And the images, those of you who have been, I hope the images really don't give credit to the way the space works, which I think I feel has been very successful. So if you haven't seen it, do go in. There's something about CGIs and even some photography which just doesn't quite capture the sense of scale that you still get in this space while having the intimacy of looking at the works of art, which you can get very close to and have a sense of sort of connection with. But this is, but as I said, this was a huge amount of work went into the thinking about how we would do this, whether we would do the partitions, what sort of partitions, what the positions of the partition should be, and then how we would hang the room. And I had some reservations, I will admit, but I completely trusted our wonderful curatorial team, who felt very strongly that this was the solution, and our design team, that this would be the best solution. And I hand it to them. They were right. They were absolutely right in their judgments. Another thing that we did on the top floor, which was we really wanted to introduce an element of the contemporary more visibly into the gallery. And thanks to some very benign philanthropy, a work was commissioned by Cecily Brown, the British artist who lives largely in New York, who has produced this wonderful work for the site in response to her feelings about the collection. And in fact, there are many hidden references to the collection in the work, which came in 3 separate panels and was installed just before the opening. There is actually, interestingly, a cross-reference in the 2 male figures, which are a nice touch cross-reference that she is making from the traditional male gaze of the female body to the female gaze of the male body. But they are a slight reference to works by Edvard Munch. And interesting, our next major exhibition is going to be of Munch's work. But I'd like just to take you back to a slide I had earlier, just to say that something rather extraordinary happened, which none of us anticipated, which was the way in which this painting speaks to, and from certain angles can be seen at the same time as the Kokoschka panel, which is in the adjacent room to the right. And of course, Kokoschka work, The Myth of Prometheus, which is here on the left, was created in situ in Count Ceylon's house, where he hung all of his Rubens during his lifetime, and is certainly influenced by Rubens's work. And Cecily Brown herself declares some influence of Rubens, and these 2 works, in a fascinating way, hers, which now crosses between sort of abstract and figurative, really speak together very well indeed. So people often don't see this as they're coming up. They come up with below it and with their backs to it, and they turn to go through into the antechamber of the great room. But as they come out, they then see this wonderful contemporary work. And we're hoping over time to have a series of other commissions in this space. Now, in addition to the main rooms, we've also colonized some what were academic offices contiguous to the gallery to create a little more gallery space, and created a lovely small room for our Bloomsbury collection, and another small room which we call project space, which allows us to show a variety of collections, including collections from the Conway and the Witt, which Richard mentioned, and I'll come back to in a second. But these are areas which are going to be more frequently changing, more casual. The curators will work with the faculty, with our students, and with community groups to create these exhibitions. And so we think it's going to be very nice, rather unusual little space of two rooms, which we can be very flexible in. Now, one of the other areas I talked about was the lower ground floor. This was another major physical intervention, coinciding with and relating to some extent getting a flat level access into Somerset House through the vestibule. And what we did here was to knock through the vaults, creating a beautiful new large space, a rather magical space, which is currently housing our shop, and from a few weeks hence we'll be also having a cafe in it, and creating a brand new space which didn't exist before, and which I think will evolve in terms of its usage over time for the Courtauld, particularly when we complete phase 2. There's another image of it. It has windows to the south onto 2 courtyards, and is a rather magical space which has been revealed. But it was a very significant structural intervention, which involved us bringing in a false roadway to continue to be able to bring in the big trucks, which are going to set up all the events at Somerset House Courtyard. And at times we wondered whether it was going to be achievable. And the concrete brought in to complete it was brought in a week before the March 2020 lockdown. So it was a miracle, and it was all a single casting of the concrete. And thank God it worked perfectly. Now, I reference that because that's the beginning. I just want to say a few words about some of the challenges of the project. I mean, there were many challenges in discovering elements of the building that were not documented. The predecessors in the 1980s certainly had not created a full set of complete plans. And so they now do exist, of course. But the most amazing of the discoveries, of which there were many, 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 was this, which was, we first got down to the level of the top left-hand image, which was a sort of medieval, a sort of a Tudor floor, but taking that floor out, it then went down and down and down. This is a late medieval cesspit. It's one of the only archaeological remains that come from the pre-original Tudor Somerset House buildings. It goes back to the medieval residences of the Bishops of London. So really quite exciting. Excavated by the Museum of London Archaeology Unit. There are a number of wonderful finds, and we're certainly going to have a space on our website explaining all of this in detail, but we're hoping at some point to have a display cabinet to show some of the finds, which once cleaned up are really rather beautiful. But this is not something that we anticipated. Of course, it added cost, it added timetable and so on to the project. Of course, the other great challenge was COVID, but we managed to keep the project going, thank God, through COVID. The building trades were able to continue, but they had very special conditions to work in. They all had to have separate facilities. We'd had to move out of all the rest of the buildings anyway. We had to move the university up to right at the beginning, up to a site near King's Cross, but other staff had to move out with COVID and couldn't move back in again. And in some cases still haven't been able to, as the work staff all had to take over the rest of the building. So that delayed the timetable. But in many ways, we were very fortunate as we managed to open up on, albeit a delayed timetable, but in November last year. I'm very grateful to the Heritage Lottery Funds, the National Lottery Heritage Fund, who not only gave us the first great grant to kickstart the project, but also gave us additional money to cover some of the costs of the delay with COVID. Now, part of that project, of course, was not just it's very much people-oriented. This is not just a physical building. And again, Richard referenced the digitization projects we're doing with our great libraries. This is the digitization of the Conway Library, which is mostly architectural, but not only. And over the time of the project, which is now coming to completion and which will be going online this summer, we have worked with, I think, nearly 1,200 volunteers, which is really stunning. It's a very exciting project and has made us sort of many friends. We've made many friends, and we hope many friends have made many friends amongst themselves. And these volunteers, many of them continue to work through COVID, doing their work online, adding blogs, interpreting the collection, doing all sorts of exciting things. We also had a big national partners program. I won't give you all the activities that we did, but this one was interesting in that it related, we gave a logic to it, or created a logic, which has proved really dynamic by linking up with centres where Courtauld Limited, the original company from which the money came that gave Courtauld his great wealth, which, having started as goldsmiths in the 17th century, became textile manufacturers in the 18th and into the 19th and into the 20th centuries. And their biggest expansion was really with synthetics and then later chemicals and paints in the 20th century. The sites where these factories were are all now closed down. These were major employers in Coventry, Preston, Belfast, in Wolverhampton, and in Hull. And they and other places, whether Braintree in Essex, another early development for Courtaulds. And we've worked with groups in all these places with different projects, which have all been very creative, ranging from working with young people, for example, as one of the projects in Hull at the Courtauld Gallery for a mindfulness exhibition, really centering on Monet's Antibes, and which has now got a musical composition relating to it, but also working with men mostly, but also women and their families who had worked for Courtauld Limited at the latter end of the history of the company, and looking at where the sites were and so on. So, and also selecting works, like it's very much a matter of co-curating. We also had an international tour and had the drama of our collection getting holed up in the middle of COVID in Japan and having to courier it home virtually. But delighted to have the bar back where it belongs, with Suzanne, the heroine of the bar, in the great room. But just to look forward again, this is still only partway through the project. At the end of this summer, we will have moved our conservation department back into the West Wing. The building work is all done, but the sort of fit out is going on. And then we have to remember that we are now a big academic community. This is in the days when we were able to celebrate in Somerset House Courtyard at a degree day. But the next stage of the project is our East Wing. So everything to the right of the centre and everything below it, which is where our teaching and learning operation will return, and also another building which we lease on the Strand just outside. And part of that, a major part of that, is the libraries, which I'll show you some sight of. Now, this shows also both the book library, elements of the Conway Library, which you've seen before, but also the Great Wit Library, which is images of paintings, and which we are in the process of digitizing too. And what we hope to do is to get back to something closer to the library. Actually, I hope it'd be even better than this, the library as it was when the Courtauld moved back in here in 1989. It's a magnificent vaulted brick structure, which I think will be another of the architectural wonders of the Courtauld, along with the great room. The other exciting thing that's happening is, as you may well know, is that the Strand is being pedestrianised. This shows us here in this rather funny configuration at the north end of the Somerset House, but the whole area to its north is now in the middle of being pedestrianised. So the access to the Courtauld will be hugely benefited and will help with the dynamism of the whole site. And then finally, I know my chairman, Lord Brown, would join me in wishing you all a welcome back to the Courtauld. Thanks so much.